Chapter 1. The Spark of Imagination. Think about the last time you walked alone through a quiet stretch of woods or stood on a dark beach listening to the invisible crash of the ocean. In those moments of profound stillness, it is easy to feel small. Yet, when you return to your car, unlock your front door and turn on the heating, that feeling of vulnerability vanishes. We are the undisputed masters of this planet. We split the atom, we sequence our own genetics, and we build soaring towers of glass and steel that scrape the very edges of the sky. We are so accustomed to this absolute supremacy that we carry a deep, unspoken assumption within us. We believe we were always destined to rule. We assume there was always a wide, unbridgeable chasm separating us from the rest of the natural world. But if you truly want to understand who you are, why you feel the anxieties you feel, and why our world looks the way it does, you must first shatter that illusion. Let us travel back together roughly 100,000 years to a sun-baked, unforgiving stretch of savanna. Imagine you are there. You are not a master of the earth. You are a profoundly insignificant creature, desperately trying to survive. You are hiding in a thicket of tall, dry grass, your heart hammering against your ribs. A short distance away, a pride of massive predators has just brought down a large herbivore. You do not rush forward to claim the prize. You watch terrified as they feast. When the great cats are full and sluggish, they wander away, but your turn has still not arrived. Now come the scavengers, the wild dogs and bone-crushing predators of the plains. You dare not challenge them either. You wait until the sun is high and the carcass is nothing but a stripped, bloody skeleton. Only then do you and your companions creep forward, looking nervously over your shoulders. You pick up a heavy stone, raise it high, and smash it against the long leg bone of the fallen beast. You are trying to crack it open to eat the rich, fatty marrow hidden inside. This is not a story of primitive failure. This is the true story of our genesis. For millions of years, our ancestors existed solidly in the middle of the food chain. We hunted small creatures, we gathered roots and berries, and we spent a great deal of our lives running in sheer terror from larger, faster, stronger beasts. We were marginal animals carrying on with our lives with no more impact on the global ecosystem than a flock of birds or a school of jellyfish. This long history of vulnerability left an indelible mark on our psychology. Have you ever wondered why human beings, possessing such immense power, are so frequently driven by deep-seated anxieties? Why we stockpile weapons, hoard resources, and react with such fierce cruelty to perceived threats? It is because our position at the very top of the food chain is a startlingly recent development. We did not climb the ladder slowly over millions of years, allowing the ecosystem to adjust to our power. We took a sudden, dizzying leap. We are not majestic, confident apex predators. We are a species of anxious underdogs who have suddenly found ourselves in charge of a heavily armed fortress. But we were not the only ones pacing nervously in the middle of that food chain. You and I belong to a vast, sprawling biological family, and for a very long time, it was a crowded house. We tend to view ourselves as an only child, but the Earth was once home to several distinct species of human beings walking the land at the exact same time. If you had traveled across the continents 50,000 years ago, you would have encountered humans who were heavily built and perfectly adapted to brutal, ice-choked climates. On tropical islands, you would have found human species that had evolved to be much smaller, navigating thick jungles and limited resources. We were simply the humans of one particular region, sharing a planet with siblings and cousins who laughed, played, formed friendships, and fought for survival just as we did. Yet today, we are the last ones standing. The utter disappearance of our sibling species remains one of history's most haunting mysteries. Did they fade away because they could not adapt to a changing world? Or did we, with our burgeoning abilities, actively push them out of existence? Whatever the truth may be, our solitary survival has made it dangerously easy to forget that we are just one branch of a very large tree. The question then becomes, what gave us the ultimate advantage? We were not the strongest, we were not the fastest, and we were certainly not the most imposing. We did have large brains, but a large brain is a massive biological expense. It drains energy, it requires us to be born prematurely and helpless, and it demands years of intense communal care. For a long time, those large brains did not seem to be doing us much good. We had fire, which was a magnificent tool. It allowed us to cook, which unlocked new calories, shrank our digestive tracts, and freed up even more energy for our growing minds. It gave us light in the darkness and a weapon against the beasts that haunted our nights. But even with fire, we remained a marginal presence. Then, something extraordinary happened. A spark ignited within our minds, triggering a revolution in the way we communicated and thought. We crossed a threshold, acquiring an ability that would ultimately allow us to reshape the planet. Many animals have language. They can vocalize danger, signaling to their pack that a predator is approaching from the sky or from the grass. They can share practical, immediate information about the physical world. Our ancient ancestors could surely do this as well. Furthermore, they could likely share social information. They could communicate about who in the tribe was trustworthy, who was cheating, and who was forming alliances. This type of social communication, the original form of gossip, was incredibly valuable. It allowed early humans to form tighter bonds and cooperate in larger groups. But even the most complex social grooming has a natural limit. You can only maintain intimate trust with a certain number of individuals. Once a group grows too large, the social fabric frays and the tribe splinters. The true magic of our cognitive leap was not the ability to talk about the physical world, nor the ability to talk about each other. It was the breathtaking ability to talk about things that do not exist at all. Suddenly, our ancestors could look at the dark, rustling forest and imagine spirits moving among the trees. They could envision mythical guardians, divine creators, and abstract concepts that had no physical form. They could weave complex, compelling fictions. This might seem like a trivial evolutionary quirk. Why waste time imagining phantoms when you need to be hunting for real food? But this ability to create and believe in shared fictions is the single most powerful force in human history. Why? Because while a handful of people can cooperate if they know each other intimately, millions of complete strangers can cooperate seamlessly if they believe in the exact same story. Consider the world you live in today. Think of a massive, global corporation, perhaps a company that manufactures the smartphone in your pocket or the car in your driveway. What exactly is this company? It is not the buildings. If an earthquake leveled all its factories, the company would still exist. It is not the employees or the executives. They could all resign tomorrow and be entirely replaced, yet the company would endure. It is not the physical products, which are just metal, plastic, and glass. The company has no physical body. You cannot point to it in the natural world. It exists entirely and exclusively as a legal fiction. It is a story written by lawmakers, validated by judges, and believed in by millions of consumers, employees, and investors. Because we all collectively agree to believe in this invisible entity, it has the power to move mountains, extract resources from the deep earth, and orchestrate the labor of hundreds of thousands of strangers who have never met. This is the power of the imagined reality. Once we acquired this ability, we were no longer confined to the slow, agonizing pace of biological evolution. For millions of years, if a social species needed to change its hierarchy or its way of life, it had to wait for a genetic mutation to alter its hardwiring. But humans, armed with the power of fiction, could change their behavior practically overnight. If the story changed, the society changed. A deeply ingrained system of absolute monarchy could be overthrown in a single season, replaced by a totally new story of universal rights and democratic rule. We bypassed biology and entered the fast lane of cultural evolution. This dual reality, the physical world of rivers, trees, and stones, running parallel to the imagined world of nations, laws, and gods, became our ultimate weapon. When you can organize thousands of individuals around a shared myth, you become an unstoppable force. A single human is still a weak, vulnerable ape, but 1,000 humans, moving as a single entity driven by a shared belief, can reshape the face of the earth. This cognitive awakening separated us from every other creature that has ever breathed. It allowed us to invent games of astonishing complexity, building layer upon layer of myth and meaning. But what did our ancestors do with this new, terrifying power? Once the spark of imagination was lit, how did they live, love, and survive in the vast, untamed wilderness before the dawn of agriculture? To understand the world we have built, we must first look closely at the footprint we left as we began to wander across the globe. Chapter 2. The Footprint of the Forager. If you walk into a modern grocery store today, you are surrounded by a blinding abundance of calories, neatly packaged and perfectly preserved. Yet, as you navigate those brightly lit aisles, you might feel a strange, lingering sense of stress, a low-level hum of anxiety about your health, your weight, your job, or your mortgage. We often look back at the distant past and imagine that our ancient ancestors lived in a state of constant, shivering misery, struggling to survive against famine and predators. Alternatively, we swing to the opposite extreme, romanticizing them as peaceful, noble wanderers perfectly in tune with a pristine Mother Earth. The truth, as always, is far more complex, much more fascinating, and deeply human. To understand who we are today, we must step out of the grocery store and immerse ourselves in the reality of the world before the first seed was ever planted. For tens of thousands of years, our minds, our bodies, and our social habits were forged in the roaming bands of hunter-gatherers. We are, in our deepest psychology, still those foragers. When you find yourself instinctively reaching for a sugary treat or a high-fat snack, even when you are full, it is not a failure of your modern willpower. It is the ghost of your ancient ancestor guiding your hand. In the ancient forests, a sweet, calorie-dense food, like a ripe piece of fruit, was a rare and fleeting treasure. If you found it, the only logical survival strategy was to consume as much of it as physically possible before the local wildlife beat you to it. We still carry that gorge instinct in our DNA, playing out an ancient survival script in a world of endless, artificial abundance. But what was it really like to wake up in that ancient world? Imagine opening your eyes to the crisp morning air, surrounded by the familiar breathing of your closest friends and relatives. You belong to a small, intimate band of perhaps a few dozen people. You know every single person intimately. There is no crippling modern loneliness, no isolation in a high-rise apartment, no commuting for hours in a metal box. Your day does not begin with the blare of an alarm clock or the dread of a repetitive factory job. Instead, you and your companions set out into the surrounding landscape, a terrain you know better than the layout of your own modern home. You possess a mental encyclopedia of astonishing depth. You know the exact life cycle of every plant, the medicinal properties of certain barks, and the subtle shifts in the wind that predict a coming storm. You know how to tread silently, how to read the tracks in the mud, and how to craft a razor-sharp tool from a piece of raw stone in a matter of minutes. Today, we rely on a massive network of strangers to provide for our basic needs. We are specialists, highly skilled in one narrow field, but utterly dependent on the collective for survival. The ancient forager, however, was a generalist of the highest order, perhaps the most knowledgeable and physically capable individual to ever walk the earth. The lifestyle was remarkably comfortable, while people in the modern developing world might break their backs working grueling 80-hour weeks, and those in affluent societies hustle through stressful 40-hour weeks. The ancient forager worked far less. Gathering food, tracking small game, and maintaining the camp might take only a handful of hours each day. By the early afternoon, the work was done. The rest of the day was yours to sit around the fire, tell stories, play with the children, and simply be present with your people. Furthermore, because you moved across a vast territory, harvesting whatever was in season, your diet was incredibly varied and rich in nutrients. You were not dependent on a single crop, meaning that a localized drought or a blight would not automatically condemn your family to starvation. You were taller, healthier, and largely free from the devastating infectious diseases that would later ravage crowded agricultural cities. Yet, we must not paint this life as a flawless paradise. The natural world is profoundly unforgiving. Think of a tight-knit band navigating a harsh, unexpected winter, the elderly and the sick who could no longer keep pace with the group. represented a heartbreaking vulnerability. Survival required agonizing choices. Imagine the emotional weight of a family realizing that to save the young and the healthy, an ailing elder might have to be quietly left behind in the snow, or a newborn born in a time of severe famine might not be allowed to live. These were not acts of casual malice, but the devastating arithmetic of survival. Violence, too, cast a long shadow. Conflicts between neighboring bands over territory or resources could flare into sudden, lethal clashes. It was a world of intense intimacy and profound connection. But it was also a world where a minor injury could easily become a death sentence, and the margin for error was perilously thin. As these bands grew and splintered, they began to push the boundaries of their known world, driven by climate shifts, social conflicts, or perhaps just the sheer insatiable curiosity that defines our kind. They walked toward the horizon. And this is where the story of the forager takes a monumental turn. With their sophisticated language, their thermal clothing stitched from animal hides, and their mastery of fire, our ancestors achieved something no other large terrestrial mammal had ever done. They broke out of their original ecological boundaries. They crossed treacherous, icy land bridges and navigated vast open oceans on primitive rafts. Imagine the moment a band of these explorers first set foot on a completely alien continent, a landmass that had been isolated for millions of years. They stepped onto beaches and into forests teeming with creatures straight out of a fantasy novel. They looked up to see giant, flightless birds towering over the trees and massive, heavily armored herbivores grazing peacefully in the valleys. These animals were titans, the absolute rulers of their ecosystems. But there was a fatal flaw in this untouched paradise. Because these giant beasts had evolved over millions of years without the presence of human beings, they had no instinctual fear of the small, frail-looking two-legged apes that had just arrived on their shores. A massive, 2-ton creature would look at a human hunter and simply continue chewing its leaves, unaware that this newcomer possessed the deadliest weapon on Earth, cooperative intelligence. Our ancestors did not just adapt to these new worlds, they completely transformed them. They used fire not just for warmth, but as a landscaping tool, intentionally burning vast tracts of impenetrable forest to create open grasslands that would attract the game they preferred to hunt. They stalked the great giants, using coordinated ambushes to bring them down. A large animal breeds very slowly. It takes a long time to gestate, and years to reach maturity. If a human band killed even one of these magnificent giants every few months, the death rate would quickly outpace the birth rate. The result was the greatest and swiftest ecological catastrophe the animal kingdom had ever seen. Within a shockingly brief period following the arrival of humans, the vast majority of these unique, majestic species simply vanished from the face of the earth. Food chains that had been stable for eons snapped and collapsed. We left behind a trail of silence where the giants once roamed. It is a sobering reality to confront. We are not just a species that eventually learned to pollute the skies and the oceans in the modern era, long before the invention of the wheel, long before the first word was written, and long before the first metal was forged. We were already a profoundly destructive force of nature. The wandering bands of storytelling humans completely rewired the ecology of our planet. This is the true footprint of the forager. It is a legacy of incredible resilience, breathtaking ingenuity, and deeply moving social bonds. But it is also a legacy of dominance. We mastered the environment to such a degree that we began to reshape it to suit our immediate needs, unaware of the long-term consequences. And as we grew more confident, more numerous, and more demanding of the earth, we stood on the precipice of a new revolution. We were about to attempt something unprecedented. We were going to stop wandering, and we were going to try to control the very source of life itself. We thought we were stepping into an era of ease and prosperity. We had no idea we were walking into the greatest trap in history. Chapter 3. The Trap of Comfort. Think of someone you know who has worked tirelessly their entire life, chasing the promise of a peaceful, comfortable future. Perhaps they started with a modest job, dreaming of earning just enough to relax and enjoy their days. But then came the promotion, which required longer hours. With the higher salary came a larger house, which required a larger mortgage, which demanded an even higher-paying, more stressful position to maintain. To save time, they bought every modern convenience: faster cars, smarter phones, instant communication devices, believing these tools would finally carve out some leisure time. Instead, the phone tethered them to their desk even when they were at the dinner table. The conveniences became absolute necessities. The luxuries transformed into rigid obligations, and the dream of a relaxed life evaporated into a frantic, endless sprint just to stay in the exact same place. We look at this modern predicament and sigh at the complexities of contemporary life, but this is not a new phenomenon. This is the oldest, most seductive trap in human history. It is the trap of comfort, and our ancestors walked blindly into it over 10,000 years ago, altering the destiny of our species forever. For countless generations, we lived as dynamic, adaptable wanderers. We moved with the seasons, hunting diverse game and foraging a vibrant array of wild foods. But slowly, imperceptibly, the climate warmed and certain wild grasses began to proliferate in fertile valleys. A wandering band of humans might have paused in one of these lush areas, noticing that a particular yellow grain was abundant and nourishing. Wanting to make their lives just a little bit easier, they decided to stay an extra week to harvest it. The next year, to ensure an even better yield, they cleared away some competing weeds. A few generations later, they began lugging heavy buckets of water from the river to hydrate the soil under the scorching sun. They built walls to keep out hungry animals. They stopped wandering altogether to guard their precious fields. We love to tell ourselves a triumphant story of human ingenuity, where our brilliant ancestors cracked the code of nature, invented farming, and liberated themselves from the harsh wilderness to build glorious civilizations. But look closely at the physical and daily reality of that early farmer, and a very different picture emerges. Human bodies were beautifully sculpted by evolution to climb trees, sprint across open plains, and navigate complex, uneven terrain. We were not designed for the agonizing, repetitive labor of clearing rocks, hoeing hard dirt, and carrying heavy loads of water day after day. The shift to farming brought an epidemic of slipped discs, ruined knees, and painful hernias. Furthermore, our ancestors traded a rich, varied diet of dozens of plants and animals for a monotonous, vulnerable diet based on a single crop. If the rains failed or a swarm of insects descended, the entire community faced catastrophic starvation. They gathered in crowded permanent settlements, living in close proximity to their own waste and their newly tamed animals, creating the perfect, tragic breeding ground for devastating infectious diseases. We did not domesticate the wild grasses. The grasses domesticated us. The wild grain manipulated an intelligent, free-roaming ape into breaking its own back to ensure the plant's global propagation. If life became so grueling, so disease-ridden, and so vulnerable, why didn't our ancestors simply drop their crude plows and walk back into the forest? Because the trap had already snapped shut. The defining feature of farming is that it produces a massive surplus of food per acre of land. This surplus allowed families to have more children closer together. A nomadic band cannot carry 5 infants at once, but a settled farming village can. The population exploded. If a village of 100 foragers swelled to a town of 1,000 farmers, there was no going back. You cannot feed 1,000 people by foraging in the nearby woods. To return to the old ways would mean letting hundreds of children starve. They were locked into their new, back-breaking reality by the sheer weight of their own numbers. And we were not the only ones caught in this snare. The pursuit of agricultural security led us to change the destiny of the animals around us. We stopped simply hunting wild beasts and began to capture, control, and breed them. We took wild, magnificent creatures with complex social structures and innate desires to roam, and we broke them. We corralled them into narrow pens, severed the bonds between mothers and their offspring, and systematically bred out their natural independence. The most aggressive, spirited animals were slaughtered first. The most submissive were allowed to live and reproduce. In evolutionary terms, measuring success strictly by the sheer number of DNA copies on the planet, these tamed farm animals became some of the most successful species to ever exist. But this numerical triumph masks an ocean of individual suffering. They were stripped of their natural instincts and condemned to live brief, confined lives as mere cogs in a biological machine, entirely subjugated to the needs of their human masters. Settling down also profoundly changed human psychology. The forager lived entirely in the present moment, trusting the environment to provide. The farmer, however, was forced to invent a brand new, paralyzing emotion, chronic anxiety about the future. A farmer's entire survival depended on events months or years away. They had to look at a cloudless sky and worry about a drought next season. They had to sweat in the summer heat, toiling relentlessly to fill a granary so their children would not starve in the winter. This obsession with the future, this desperate need to produce a surplus, became the foundation of all massive human societies. But here is the most bitter irony of the trap. The exhausted peasants who dug the irrigation canals and harvested the grain rarely got to enjoy the security they so desperately sought. The overflowing granaries did not lead to a utopia of well-fed, leisurely farmers. Instead, the surplus acted as a powerful magnet. It attracted those who realized they no longer needed to farm at all. History is essentially the story of the very few people who figured out how to live off the surplus produced by the exhausted many. These were the kings, the priests, the generals, and the bureaucrats. They constructed fortified palaces, demanded taxes, and formed specialized armies. To hold these massive, unequal societies together, these elites could not rely on violence alone. You cannot force thousands of people to hand over their hard-earned harvest merely by pointing a spear at them. Eventually, they will outnumber and overthrow you. To maintain order, the rulers utilized the exact same cognitive superpower our foraging ancestors had developed, the ability to weave a shared fiction. They created elaborate, imagined orders. In the ancient world, these fictions took the form of divine legal codes. A ruler would declare that the gods themselves had decreed a strict hierarchy. Some humans were inherently superior, born to rule and enjoy wealth, while others were inherently inferior, born to toil and obey. Millions of people, raised from birth to believe in this story, accepted their grueling lives as the natural, unchangeable order of the universe. In modern times, we tell a different story. We write sweeping, eloquent documents declaring that every single human being is born perfectly equal, endowed with identical inherent rights. Biologically speaking, neither story is an objective fact. Nature knows nothing of inherent social classes, nor does it know anything of universal equality or inalienable rights. Nature is a blind process of mutation and variation. Both the ancient code of hierarchy and the modern declaration of equality are myths. They are magnificent, powerful, intersubjective realities, stories that exist only because millions of people collectively agree to believe in them, and they are absolutely essential. Without these shared myths, the massive networks of human cooperation would instantly dissolve into chaotic violence. The trap of comfort gave us overflowing storehouses, but it cost us our egalitarian freedom. It chained us to the soil, tethered us to our anxieties about tomorrow, and bound us within massive, invisible webs of rules, taxes, and social classes. As these new societies grew, the sheer volume of laws, debts, and property records became too vast for any human brain to remember. The elites needed a new tool to manage their burgeoning empires, a tool that would permanently alter how human beings think and inadvertently cement the very structures of inequality that define the modern world. Chapter 4. The Architecture of Inequality. Have you ever walked into a room and completely forgotten why you went in, or struggled to recall a phone number you were just told moments ago? Do not be too hard on yourself. Your brain is a magnificent, highly specialized organ, but it was not designed to process the kind of world you live in today. For millions of years, the human mind evolved to excel at very specific tasks. It became beautifully adapted to remembering the winding topography of a forest, the seasonal blooming patterns of edible plants, and the intricate shifting social webs of a small community. If you needed to know which member of your tribe was secretly angry with another, or which mushrooms would heal you and which would kill you, your brain was a flawless biological supercomputer. But when our ancestors settled down and began building vast agricultural empires, a completely new type of information became absolutely critical to their survival: numbers. Imagine a tribal elder trying to manage a newly formed city. In a small village, this elder could simply memorize who contributed a basket of grain and who owed a favor. But once that village swelled to 50,000 strangers, the biological limits of the human mind were breached. The elder needed to track millions of data points: who paid their taxes, who owned which plot of land, who was in debt, and who was exempt. Our brains are incredibly poor at storing and retrieving endless lists of mathematical data. When faced with this overwhelming flood of numbers, the mental hard drive crashed. Without a way to manage this data, early societies would have collapsed under their own weight. To solve this, human beings invented a profound workaround. We developed a system to store information outside of our own biological bodies. We invented writing. We often romanticize the dawn of writing, imagining ancient sages inscribing beautiful poetry or profound philosophical truths onto parchment. But the reality is far more pragmatic. The very first written marks in human history were not love letters or epic myths. They were tax ledgers and property records. They were the dull, repetitive calculations of bureaucracy. This invention did more than just preserve data. It fundamentally altered how human beings think. The natural human mind operates holistically, flowing from one association to the next. The smell of rain might remind you of a childhood home, which reminds you of your mother, which makes you think of a song she used to sing. But you cannot run a kingdom on free association. Bureaucracy demands rigid compartmentalization. To find a specific property deed among thousands of clay tablets or knotted strings, you must organize everything into distinct, separate categories. You must create a mental filing cabinet. As generation after generation learned to read, write, and record, we slowly trained ourselves to stop thinking like holistic humans and start thinking like clerks and accountants. Once we began sorting our grain, our land, and our debts into rigid categories, it was only a matter of time before we applied that exact same filing cabinet mentality to human beings. As populations exploded into the millions, we could no longer rely on personal familiarity to know who to trust or how to behave around strangers. We needed a shortcut. We needed labels. And so, the great imagined hierarchies of history were born. Imagine a fictional valley split by a rushing river. On one side live the mountain dwellers, on the other the river folk. For centuries they are equals, but one year a freak flood devastates the river folk's harvest. Facing starvation, they beg the mountain dwellers for grain. The mountain dwellers agree, but demand physical labor in exchange for the debt. The river folk spend the next decade working the high fields. Because they are working so hard, they cannot educate their children or improve their own lands. Generations pass. The original flood is long forgotten. Now, the mountain dwellers are wealthy, educated, and hold all the political power, while the river folk are poor, uneducated, and perform only the hardest manual labor. At this point, a dangerous psychological shift occurs. The mountain dwellers look down at the struggling river folk, and they do not see the lingering effects of a historical accident. Instead, they tell themselves a story to justify the inequality. They say, "Look at them. They are uneducated. They are suited only for the dirtiest jobs. It must be because they are inherently inferior. The universe, or the gods, or biology itself, has made us the natural rulers, and them the natural servants." This is the tragic, vicious circle of human inequality. A random historical event creates an initial disparity in power or wealth. The group in power writes laws to protect their newly acquired status. The oppressed group is denied education and opportunity, guaranteeing they remain impoverished. Finally, the ruling class looks at the poverty and ignorance of the oppressed group and uses it as proof that they are naturally inferior, which justifies writing even more discriminatory laws. Every major system of social segregation in history relies on this exact same self-deception. To enforce these artificial boundaries, societies weaponize one of our deepest biological instincts, the fear of disease. If you want to permanently isolate a specific group of people, you do not just call them inferior. You convince the rest of society that they are unclean. You claim that interacting with them, eating with them, or marrying them will pollute the entire community. This concept of purity and pollution is deeply ingrained in our biology to protect us from pathogens, but it has been hijacked by human cultures to protect political power. Of all the filing cabinet categories we have invented, none has been as universal, as enduring, and as deeply personal as the division of gender. Almost every society in recorded history has divided its people into masculine and feminine roles, and almost universally they have granted superior rights, resources, and respect to the masculine. But is this hierarchy a product of nature or a product of our imagination? Biology dictates the physical sex of an individual, providing different chromosomes and reproductive organs. But biology does not dictate that one group should vote, own property, or command armies while the other stays home. Culture does that. A brilliant rule of thumb for understanding the world is this: biology enables while culture forbids. Biology is endlessly flexible. It allows for a massive spectrum of behaviors, desires, and abilities. It is our imagined cultural stories that step in and declare certain natural behaviors to be unnatural or strictly forbidden. Many have tried to argue that masculine dominance is simply a matter of physical strength, that because men are, on average, physically stronger, they naturally forced their way to the top of the societal pyramid. But this argument collapses under the weight of human reality. Look at the true mechanics of power. If physical strength equaled social power, then the heavyweight champion of the world would be the global emperor. Throughout history, the people at the very bottom of the social ladder, the slaves, the peasants, the manual laborers, have performed the most grueling physical tasks and possessed incredible physical strength. The people at the very top, the politicians, the aging generals, the wealthy elites, rarely use their own muscles. Power in human society is not derived from the ability to lift a heavy stone. It is derived from the ability to navigate complex social networks, to appease rivals, and to inspire cooperation. Therefore, the physical strength argument cannot explain why human societies structured themselves this way. We are left to grapple with the uncomfortable truth that the immense architectures of inequality that govern our lives, the rigid categories of class, the dividing lines of race, the strict expectations of gender, are not unshakable laws of nature. They are fictions, born from the limits of our memory and the bureaucratic need to organize millions of strangers. They are sustained by stories we tell ourselves over and over until we forget that we were the ones who wrote them. Yet, as these isolated, hierarchical empires expanded, they began to bump into one another. The world was full of different cultures, each deeply convinced that their specific gods, their unique laws, and their particular hierarchies were the only true ones. How could these radically different, fiercely proud societies ever learn to communicate, let alone unify? To bring the globe together, humankind needed to invent a completely new kind of story. They needed a fiction so powerful, so irresistibly pragmatic, that absolutely everyone, regardless of their language, their religion, or their social class, would be desperate to believe in it. Chapter 5. The Universal Trust. Imagine stepping far away from the Earth, so far that you can view the entire span of human existence not in days or years, but in blocks of millennia, when we are caught in the daily grind of our lives, or even when we read a standard history text detailing the rise and fall of specific nations. The human story can look like a chaotic, senseless storm of random events. It appears to be a cycle of fragmentation, where groups constantly break apart, fight, and dissolve. But when you adopt this cosmic vantage point and watch the centuries fly by in seconds, a breathtakingly clear pattern emerges. History has a definitive direction, and that direction is relentlessly moving toward global unity. Over thousands of years, small, isolated pockets of humanity have consistently merged into larger, more complex societies. We often make the mistake of thinking that human cultures are rigid, timeless things. We imagine that our ancestors lived in perfect, unchanging harmony with a static set of beliefs that were passed down flawlessly from generation to generation. The truth is much more turbulent and vibrant. Every culture is a living, breathing entity, and like all living things, it is in a state of constant flux. This change is not just driven by outside forces or shifting weather patterns. It is driven by internal contradictions. No human society is perfectly logical. We are all forced to juggle conflicting ideals, balancing deeply held beliefs that actively oppose one another. Think of a deeply modern dilemma that you or someone you know probably wrestles with. On one hand, we cherish the idea of absolute personal liberty, the freedom to live exactly as we choose, to keep what we earn, and to make our own unhindered decisions. On the other hand, we hold a profound desire for a perfectly equal, compassionate society where no one is left behind to suffer in poverty. Yet, you cannot enforce perfect equality without restricting individual liberty, and you cannot have absolute liberty without creating massive inequalities. This tension is not a flaw in our culture. It is the very engine of our progress. The constant attempt to reconcile our contradictory beliefs forces us to adapt, to argue, and to evolve. This friction pushes humanity forward, gradually weaving isolated tribes into massive, interconnected webs. But how do you actually unite people who have entirely different languages, totally different gods, and completely different ways of life? For most of our evolutionary history, we were hardwired to divide the world into two simple categories, us and them. Us was the small band of people we knew intimately, and them was absolutely everyone else, strangers to be feared, avoided, or fought. To overcome this deeply ingrained biological boundary, humanity required tools of unprecedented imaginative power. We needed universal concepts that could encompass the entire globe, turning every human being into a potential partner. The first and arguably most powerful of these global unifiers was not a conquering army or a persuasive prophet, but a brilliant economic fiction. To understand the sheer genius of this invention, you must put yourself in the shoes of a skilled tradesperson in an ancient, growing town. Let us say you are a masterful carpenter. You spend your days turning rough timber into beautiful, sturdy dining tables. One evening, your family's hungry and you need meat. You carry one of your heavy wooden tables across town to the butcher, but the butcher shakes his head. He already has a table, and what he really needs is a new pair of boots. You now face an agonizing puzzle. You must haul your table to the cobbler, hoping the cobbler needs furniture and is willing to trade boots for it, so that you can then take the boots to the butcher to finally get your meat. But what if a table is worth 50 pairs of boots? You do not need 50 pairs of boots. How do you divide a table? This is the crippling limitation of a barter economy. As societies grew and people became highly specialized in their skills, trading physical goods for other physical goods became a logistical nightmare. The mental load of tracking the exchange rate between every single item in a marketplace, apples to shoes, tables to meat, wool to iron, was impossible for the human brain to manage. The solution was a leap of collective imagination. People invented a placeholder, an intermediate token that could represent the value of absolutely anything. They invented money. It is crucial to realize that money is not a physical reality. It is a psychological construct. It does not matter if the money is a stamped gold coin, a beautifully printed piece of paper, a string of polished shells, or a digital blip on a bank's computer server. The physical object itself is completely worthless. You cannot eat a gold coin, you cannot wear a paper dollar to stay warm, and you cannot drink a digital ledger. Money works entirely because it is the most sophisticated and universally accepted system of mutual trust ever devised. When the butcher hands over a cut of meat in exchange for a little disc of metal, he is acting on an extraordinary amount of faith. He does not inherently want the metal. He takes it because he completely trusts that tomorrow the baker will accept that same disc of metal in exchange for a loaf of bread. Money is essentially a token of universal trust. And the most astonishing thing about this trust is that it crosses all boundaries. You and I might disagree passionately about politics. We might worship different deities, speak different languages, and hold entirely opposite moral values. We might even be engaged in a bitter, multi-generational blood feud. Yet, if I offer you a universally recognized currency for your goods, you will take it. You do not need to trust me. You only need to trust the money. Throughout history, bitter enemies who would happily slaughter one another on the battlefield have eagerly traded with each other using the exact same coins. Money is the only story ever invented that everyone, everywhere, actually believes. It is the ultimate bridge between strangers. However, this magnificent unifier carries a dark and heavy cost. Because money relies on universal convertibility, the idea that anything can be turned into anything else, it possesses a deeply corrosive power. Before money, human communities relied on local, intimate trust. You helped your neighbor build a barn, and they helped you harvest your crops. These exchanges were bound by honor, affection, and social duty. But when money entered the picture, it allowed us to bypass human connection. We no longer needed to rely on the goodwill of our neighbors. We could simply buy what we needed from a stranger. This cold, efficient transaction slowly erodes the warm, messy, intimate bonds of human community. We begin to put a price on things that were once considered sacred. Loyalty, art, love, and human life itself slowly get dragged into the marketplace, evaluated by the ruthless laws of supply and demand. We built a global network of unimaginable scope, connecting billions of people in a web of seamless trade, but we paid for it by isolating ourselves from the people standing right next to us. Money laid the foundation for a unified globe, proving that millions of strangers could operate within a single shared system. But commerce alone could not govern the hearts and minds of humanity. To truly bind the world together, to dictate the moral and political structures of these vast new networks, other forces had to step onto the stage. The marketplace was built, but it now required architects and visionaries to decide who would rule it and what higher purpose it might serve. Chapter 6. The Iron Fist and the Divine. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the land where your ancestors have lived for 1,000 years. It is a beautiful, secluded valley. Your people have their own unique language, full of words that perfectly describe the specific morning mist that rolls over your hills. You have your own songs, your own dances, and your own local deities who reside in the ancient forests and the rushing rivers. You know exactly who you are, and you know who your enemies are, the neighboring tribe across the ridge with whom you occasionally skirmish over hunting grounds. Your world is small, self-contained, and deeply familiar. Then, one day, the horizon darkens. Banners you have never seen before crest the hills. The ground shakes with the synchronized march of 10,000 soldiers, clad in uniform armor, speaking a harsh, alien tongue. They are the vanguard of a massive, distant empire, and they have come to claim your valley. You fight back, of course. Your people fight with desperate, breathtaking courage, but your local weapons and tribal tactics are no match for the relentless, highly organized military machine of the invaders. Your warriors are crushed. Your leaders are slain. Your valley is absorbed into a sprawling political entity that stretches further than you can possibly comprehend. For you, and for the generation that survives the slaughter, this is an absolute tragedy. It is the end of the world. You are forced to pay crushing taxes to a faceless emperor you will never see, and your children are conscripted to fight in foreign wars against people they have never met. But let us fast forward 3 generations. Your great-grandchildren are born into this vast empire. They have never known the independent valley. They walk on paved roads built by imperial engineers. They drink water from imperial aqueducts. When they are wronged, they do not rely on local blood feuds. They take their disputes to an imperial court where a standardized law is applied. Most profoundly, they do not speak the language of the old valley, at least not in public. They speak the language of the conquerors. They read the conquerors' poetry, they wear the conquerors' clothing, and they study the conquerors' philosophy. Eventually, a remarkable psychological shift occurs. Your descendants, completely steeped in this new culture, look at the imperial capital not as an alien oppressor, but as their own inheritance. They begin to demand the rights and privileges of imperial citizens. They say, "We speak your language, we fight in your armies, we abide by your laws, we are you, treat us as equals." And eventually, the empire concedes. The descendants of the conquered become the generals, the senators, and even the emperors of the very machine that once crushed their ancestors. This is the great, uncomfortable paradox of human history. We tend to think of empires as fundamentally evil, destructive forces, casting them as the villains in all our historical narratives, and it is entirely true that empires are built on oceans of blood. They are forged through horrific violence, exploitation, and the ruthless eradication of independent cultures. Yet, we must also acknowledge an undeniable truth. Almost everything we value in human culture today was born in the crucible of an empire. Empires are the ultimate melting pots. By violently smashing down the borders between hundreds of isolated valleys, tribes, and kingdoms, the empire forces diverse peoples to mix. It creates a standardized world of shared languages, shared currencies, and shared ideas. It replaces the endless, petty wars of neighboring tribes with a vast internal peace. If you trace your own heritage back far enough, you will find that your language, your architecture, your legal system, and your favorite foods were almost certainly shaped by an empire that conquered your ancestors, or an empire your ancestors built to conquer others. The iron fist of the empire was incredibly brutal, but it was also the great unifier of humankind. It gathered thousands of fragmented human worlds and forcefully melted them down into a few massive mega-cultures. However, a unified world cannot be maintained by the sword alone. Even the most terrifying army cannot permanently suppress millions of resentful subjects. To make the newly forged mega-culture stable, to convince the peasant to pay his taxes willingly and the soldier to lay down his life on command, the empire needed a justification that transcended human violence. It needed to convince its subjects that the imperial laws were not just the arbitrary whims of a greedy ruler, but the fundamental laws of the universe itself. To achieve this, the political order looked to the sky. It harnessed the power of the divine. To understand how religion evolved into a tool of global unification, we must return to our early forager ancestors. In the ancient, untamed world, human beings saw themselves as just one small part of a vibrant, living ecosystem. They practiced what we might call local spiritualities. They believed that the old oak tree had a spirit, that the mountain had a voice, and that the river demanded respect. If a hunter needed a deer, he might perform a ritual to ask the spirit of the deer herd for permission. This worldview was deeply intimate, but it was also strictly local. The spirit of the oak tree in your valley did not care about the people living 100 miles away. You could not use the river spirit to unite a sprawling empire. But as humanity transitioned to agriculture and then to massive cities, our spiritual needs changed drastically. We no longer saw ourselves as equal partners with the deer and the oak trees. We were the masters of the land. We owned the animals, we diverted the rivers, and we cleared the forests. The local spirits were no longer sufficient. We needed gods who were as vast and complex as our new civilizations. We needed gods of agriculture who could bring the rain, gods of war who could secure victory, and gods of commerce who could bless our merchants. This gave rise to the grand, bustling pantheons of the ancient world. The universe was suddenly envisioned as a vast political arena, populated by powerful competing deities, much like a royal court. This worldview was incredibly practical and, remarkably, very tolerant. If you believe that your city is ruled by the god of the storm, and you march over the hill and discover another city that worships the goddess of the harvest, there is no inherent conflict. You can easily accept that their goddess rules their territory while your god rules yours. You might even pray to their goddess if you need a good crop. But as empires sought to unify the entire known world, a radical new idea began to take hold, an idea that would change the psychological landscape of humanity forever. What if certain thinkers and prophets began to ask, the universe is not a chaotic court of competing gods. What if. Behind the storms and the harvests, behind the sun and the moon, there is only one supreme absolute authority. What if there is only one universal truth and one supreme creator who cares intimately about the moral behavior of every single human being? This was a profoundly revolutionary concept. If you believe there is only one supreme truth, and you happen to possess it, then by definition, everyone else's beliefs are not just different. They are false. This solitary universal truth demands to be shared. It generates a fierce, burning missionary zeal. You are no longer just expanding a political border, you are saving souls. You are bringing the light of the ultimate truth to a world living in darkness. This concept of a single, universal order became the perfect spiritual counterpart to the expanding empires. The emperor was no longer just a warlord who had conquered the most land. He was the chosen representative of the supreme creator. The laws of the state were the laws of heaven. When the iron fist of the military marched into a new territory, the divine halo of the universal religion marched right beside it. Together, the empire and the universal faith worked as a formidable, relentless machine. The empire provided the roads, the funding, and the military protection for the missionaries to travel to the ends of the earth. In return, the religion provided the empire with unquestionable legitimacy, convincing the conquered peoples that their suffering was part of a divine plan and that they should obey their earthly rulers as they would obey heaven itself. This twin engine of unification systematically dissolved the ancient boundaries of us and them. If you lived in a distant province, you might not look like the emperor, and you might not share his bloodline. But if you bowed to the exact same god, prayed in the exact same language, and followed the exact same moral code, you were no longer an alien. You were a brother. You were a sister. You were part of a global family. Through the ruthless conquests of the sword and the passionate spread of the sacred text, humanity was forcefully dragged out of its isolated valleys. We were being knit together, often against our will, into a single, massive human network. The world had been explored, conquered, mapped, and categorized. We had money to trade with any stranger, empires to enforce the laws, and universal religions to tell us our exact place in the cosmos. It seemed as though we had figured everything out. We believed we possessed all the answers. But history is rarely a straight line. Just as humanity settled into the comforting illusion that we understood the universe, a new, unsettling realization began to stir. To take the final leap into the modern age, we had to do something completely counterintuitive. We had to stop pretending we knew everything, look up at the vast, mysterious sky, and make a terrifying admission. Chapter 7. The Edge of the Unknown. Think back to a moment in your own life, perhaps a decade ago, when you stood at a major crossroads. Maybe you were choosing a career, deciding whether to move to a new city, or contemplating a relationship that felt uncertain. At the time, the future was a dense, impenetrable fog. You agonized over the decision, entirely unsure of how your life would unfold. Yet, when you look back at that exact moment today, from the comfortable vantage point of the present, the fog has vanished. The path you took seems entirely logical. You can trace a neat, straight line from that past choice to your current reality, and you tell yourself a story about how it was all meant to happen exactly this way. This is a comforting illusion, and it is the exact same illusion we cast over the entire history of humankind. We look back at the grand tapestry of the past and we assume that the empires that rose were destined to rise and the cultures that fell were always doomed to fall. We imagine that history is a script written in advance, but if you could transport yourself back to the streets of a bustling ancient capital, the people walking beside you were just as blind to their future as you are to yours. Imagine two ancient armies facing each other across a wide valley. One army is massive, lavishly funded, heavily armored, and led by seasoned generals. The other is a ragged, poorly equipped band of rebels. Every spectator on the surrounding hills places their bets on the massive army. Their victory seems an absolute certainty. But on the morning of the battle, an unseasonal freak rainstorm turns the valley floor into a swamp. The heavy armor of the massive army drags them into the mud, rendering them immobile, and the lightly equipped rebels secure a miraculous victory. Centuries later, historians will write thick volumes arguing that the rebels were always destined to win because of their high morale and superior social cohesion. They will weave a narrative of inevitability, but the truth is, it was just the rain. History is not a predetermined path. It is a sprawling, wildly unpredictable storm. The chaos of human history is fundamentally different from the chaos of the natural world. If you predict the path of a hurricane, the hurricane does not hear your prediction and change its course to spite you. But human history is deeply reactive. Imagine a renowned oracle standing in a crowded marketplace, proclaiming that a great kingdom will fall to a rebellion by the end of the year. The king's spies hear this prediction and report it to the throne. The terrified king immediately lowers taxes, distributes grain to the poor, and increases the pay of his royal guard. The year passes, and there is no rebellion. Did the oracle fail, or did the very act of predicting the future alter the future? Because we react to the stories we are told, history is a mirror that constantly shifts the moment we look into it. Furthermore, as this unpredictable storm raged across the centuries, it did not necessarily move in a direction that benefited human beings. We like to believe that history bends toward justice, or that successful cultures are those that make their people happiest. But cultures operate much like a virus. A virus is not successful because it makes its host healthy. It is successful because it is exceptionally good at making copies of itself, even if it leaves the host exhausted and coughing. Similarly, historical ideas and cultural norms often replicated and spread not because they were good for the people who held them, but simply because they were highly infectious. A culture that prioritizes relentless conquest and absolute devotion might spread across entire continents, even if it brings misery and suffering to the individuals living within it. For thousands of years, facing a universe that was profoundly chaotic and deeply unjust, human beings craved an anchor. We desperately needed the illusion of absolute certainty. To cope with the terror of the unknown, the great empires and traditions of the ancient world adopted a very specific psychological armor. They claimed that they already possessed all the answers. Imagine a vast ancient library attached to a royal palace. The Grand Librarian, a man who has spent his entire life studying sacred scrolls, believes that the absolute truth of the cosmos was delivered to his ancestors long ago. He believes that the ancient texts contain the answers to every single question that matters. If a young scholar approaches him and asks why the moon turns red during an eclipse, or why a certain disease afflicts the crops, the librarian consults the scrolls. If the answer is there, it is settled. If the answer is not there, the librarian concludes that the question is trivial, for if it were truly important, the creators of the universe would surely have included it in the ancient texts. In this worldview, there is no room for new discovery. The highest form of knowledge is simply to memorize what is already known, and the greatest fear is to admit ignorance. This desperate need to project absolute knowledge extended to how we viewed the physical world itself. Consider the role of a royal cartographer in a medieval court. The king demands a map of his domain and the world beyond it to hang in his great hall. The cartographer carefully draws the kingdom, the neighboring rivers, and the trade routes he knows well. But eventually, he reaches the edge of his knowledge. He does not know what lies across the Western Ocean or beyond the southern desert. However, to present a map with a blank space to a powerful king is an insult. It implies weakness, suggesting that the king's reach is limited and that the world is full of things beyond their control. So, the cartographer fills the empty spaces. He draws terrifying sea monsters, mythical golden islands, and fierce dragons. He covers the unknown with magnificent fictions to create the illusion of a fully understood world. But roughly 500 years ago, a seismic psychological shift occurred that would change the trajectory of our species forever. A new kind of cartographer sat down at a wooden desk. He drew the coastlines of the continents he knew, and then, with a trembling hand, he did something utterly revolutionary. He left the rest of the parchment completely, starkly blank. He did not draw a dragon. He did not draw a myth. He left an empty space. It was the bravest, most powerful stroke of a pen in human history. By leaving the map blank, this cartographer and the thinkers, astronomers, and explorers who shared his new mindset made a terrifying but liberating admission. They said, "I do not know." This simple admission of ignorance was the spark that ignited the modern world. As long as you believe you already know everything, you will never look for anything new. But the moment you admit you are ignorant, the universe becomes a vast, thrilling puzzle waiting to be solved. This was the birth of the scientific mindset. We realized that the answers were not hiding in dusty scrolls written in the past. The answers were waiting in the future, waiting to be discovered through observation, measurement, and relentless curiosity. Once we gave ourselves permission to not know, the floodgates opened. We stopped arguing over interpretations of ancient texts and started looking through curved glass lenses at the craters of the moon. We stopped blaming sickness on angry spirits and started dissecting bodies to understand the intricate mechanics of the heart. We began to measure the speed of falling objects, to track the invisible currents of the ocean, and to chart the exact movements of the stars. This willingness to embrace the unknown unleashed a torrent of new technologies and powers. But this new scientific engine did not operate in a vacuum. To build the observatories, to launch the ships into the blank spaces of the map, and to fund the laboratories, science required vast amounts of resources. The men looking up at the stars needed the backing of the men who ruled the Earth, and the men who ruled the Earth quickly realized that this new, questioning mindset could be the key to unimaginable wealth and dominion. The admission of ignorance was about to marry the relentless ambition of empire, creating a global force that would rewrite the rules of human existence. Chapter 8. The Engine of Progress. Imagine standing on the wooden docks of a bustling, fog-drenched harbor several centuries ago. The air is thick with the smell of salt, tar, and wet timber. Moored before you is a massive, multi-masted wooden ship, preparing for a voyage into the complete unknown. If you look closely at the cargo being loaded onto this vessel, you will notice something deeply unusual. Yes, there are heavy iron cannons, barrels of gunpowder, and crates of salted meat, the standard tools of conquest and survival. But there are also delicate glass vials, polished brass telescopes, precision clocks, and stacks of blank, leather-bound journals. Boarding the ship alongside the hardened sailors and ambitious military officers is a peculiar group of young men holding sketch pads and measuring instruments. Why would a monarch who has spent an absolute fortune to fund this perilous journey waste precious cargo space on astronomers, botanists, and linguists? In the ancient world, conquerors did not behave this way. When armies marched across the sands of antiquity to claim new territories, they were not looking to expand their understanding of the universe. They were looking for gold, slaves, and wheat. They believed they already knew everything of importance. But the profound psychological shift that occurred when we finally admitted our own ignorance changed the very nature of conquest. The leaders of this new era realized that the blank spaces on the map were not just voids to be filled with flags. They were reservoirs of untapped knowledge. And knowledge, they discovered, was the ultimate form of power. Think of what happens when this ship finally reaches a distant, untouched shore. The soldiers disembark and secure a perimeter, but the scholars immediately scatter into the jungle. They do not just demand tribute from the local inhabitants. They spend months meticulously measuring the coastline, cataloguing the strange, vibrant flora, observing the transit of distant planets in the southern sky, and recording the phonetic sounds of the indigenous languages. When the ship eventually returns home, it brings back a treasure far more valuable than silver. The imperial capital uses the topographical maps to chart safe, efficient trade routes that rival nations cannot navigate. They use the botanical data to cultivate new, resilient crops that feed their growing populations and to synthesize medicines that cure diseases ravaging their naval fleets. They use the astronomical observations to master global navigation. The scholars receive lavish funding to build bigger laboratories and stronger telescopes, and the empire uses the resulting technological edge to build faster ships and deadlier weapons. It is a perfect, unbreakable marriage. The empire provides the funding and the physical protection required for scientific inquiry, and in return, science provides the empire with the practical tools necessary to dominate the globe. We conquered to learn, and we learned to conquer. But this magnificent, world-spanning partnership faces a colossal practical hurdle. Building fleets of ocean-going vessels, outfitting them with heavy artillery, and funding years-long scientific expeditions requires an astronomical amount of wealth. The king's treasury, no matter how vast, is finite. Where did the money come from to fuel this relentless expansion? To understand the solution, we must examine a deeply ingrained psychological barrier that held humanity back for thousands of years. For almost the entirety of human history, people believed that the total amount of wealth in the world was a fixed, unchanging reality. They viewed the global economy as a single, delicious pie of a specific size. If you wanted a larger slice of the pie, it meant that someone else, your neighbor, a rival merchant, or a neighboring kingdom, had to be left with a smaller slice. Wealth could be redistributed, stolen, or hoarded, but it could not be created. Because everyone believed the pie was fixed, people were terrified of taking financial risks. If the future was not going to be any richer than the present, why part with your gold? To break this stagnation, humanity had to invent a new moral and economic fiction. We had to learn to trust the future. Imagine a brilliant but impoverished baker living in a growing port city. She has spent years perfecting a revolutionary recipe for a dense, nutritious bread that can last for months in the damp hold of a ship without spoiling. This is a vital innovation for long sea voyages. However, she has no money. She has no flour, no firewood, and no commercial oven. In the ancient world, her brilliant idea would die with her because no one would lend her the gold. Why would a wealthy lord give his finite gold to a penniless baker? But in this new era, a profound psychological shift has occurred. People have begun to believe that the future can be larger, richer, and more abundant than the past. The baker walks into the office of a newly established institution, a financier. She passionately describes her recipe and the massive demand it will have among the naval fleets. The financier listens. He looks at her empty pockets, but he does not see poverty. He sees potential. He agrees to give her the money she needs. Here is the true magic of this transaction. The financier does not actually have chests of gold sitting in a vault to back up this loan. He is extending her a line of credit. Credit is not a physical substance. It is a shared, intersubjective belief in a future that has not yet happened. It is the financial manifestation of optimism. With this borrowed imaginary money, the baker builds her large brick oven. She hires assistants, buys flour, and bakes thousands of loaves. The naval captains, desperate for reliable rations, buy her entire stock. The baker takes her profits, repays the financier with a little extra for his trouble, and keeps the rest. The financier now has more capital to lend to a shipbuilder, who builds a ship to sail to a new continent, discovering a new resource that brings even more wealth back to the port. The pie is no longer fixed. The pie is growing. This simple realization that trust in the future creates credit, that credit funds real innovation, and that innovation creates real wealth is the beating heart of the capitalist creed. It transformed capitalism from a mere economic system into a powerful moral philosophy. In the past, the wealthy hoarded their gold in strong boxes or spent it conspicuously on lavish banquets and towering monuments to themselves. But the capitalist creed taught that profits should not be hidden under a mattress or wasted on vanity. Profits must be relentlessly reinvested into expanding production. If you make a profit, you build a second oven, you hire more workers, you fund a scientific expedition, you keep the engine turning. This belief in endless growth became the supreme religion of the modern world. It is the invisible force that binds the scientist, the emperor, and the financier together. The scientist looks at the blank map and says, "There is something out there to discover." The capitalist looks at the scientist and says, "I will lend you the money to find it, because I believe it will yield a return." The emperor looks at the capitalist and says, "I will provide the ships and the soldiers to protect your investment so long as the new territory expands my realm." Together, they built a machine of staggering power. This engine of progress pulled humanity out of the mud, drastically reducing child mortality, extending our lifespans, and connecting the darkest, most isolated corners of the globe with shipping lanes and telegraph wires. It funded the laboratories that cured ancient plagues and the universities that unraveled the genetic code. But a machine built on the premise of absolute infinite growth requires a terrifying amount of fuel. The capitalist creed demands that the pie must never stop growing, because the moment the growth stops, the fragile web of credit and trust that holds the entire system together will violently collapse. As this global engine roared into life, it began to demand more raw materials, more labor, and more energy than human muscles, wind, and water could possibly provide. We were running out of breath. To sustain this miraculous, relentless expansion, we had to find a way to break the physical limits of the natural world. We had to find a way to bend the very elements of the earth to our will, completely unaware of the profound, intimate price this new revolution would extract from our daily lives. Chapter 9. The Price of Industry. Imagine standing in the middle of a vast, golden wheat field 500 years ago. If you wanted to harvest that wheat, grind it into flour, and bake it into bread, you were bound by an absolute, unbreakable physical limit. Every swing of the scythe required the burning of calories inside a human muscle. Every turn of the grinding stone required the straining sinews of an ox, or the unpredictable pushing of the wind, or the flow of a nearby river. For millions of years, the total amount of energy available to humankind was strictly capped by the limits of flesh, blood, and the immediate natural elements. Our grandest empires and our most brilliant scientific expeditions were fundamentally powered by the sweat of living creatures. The world was organic, and therefore it was exhaustible. But as the capitalist engine demanded infinite growth, humanity hit a biological ceiling. We were running out of muscle power, and we were running out of wood to burn. To keep the machine moving forward, we had to look beneath the surface of the earth. We dug deep into the dark crust and found ancient buried sunshine trapped in the form of coal and oil. And then we made the single most important technological leap since the mastery of fire. We figured out how to convert heat into movement. When the first steam engines began to hiss and roar, the organic ceiling shattered. We realized that we did not need a horse to pull a cart. We could feed coal into an iron belly and make the cart pull itself tirelessly across entire continents. We did not need the wind to push a ship. We could boil water and conquer the oceans regardless of the weather. This was not just a shift in tools. It was a fundamental revolution in how we understood energy. We transformed the entire planet into a mechanized factory, drawing on vast, seemingly limitless reserves of power to mass-produce everything from textiles to steel. However, this mechanical mindset did not stop at inanimate objects. As we learned to treat iron and coal as mere inputs in a vast production line, we began to look at the living world through the exact same ruthless industrial lens. Consider the life of a farm animal in this new era. In the ancient world, the domestication of animals was undoubtedly cruel, but it was still an organic relationship. A cow or a pig lived outside, experienced the shifting seasons, and had some semblance of a social structure, even if its ultimate fate was the slaughterhouse. But the industrial mindset stripped away the last remaining illusions of empathy. We began to view living, breathing creatures as nothing more than biological machines designed to convert feed into meat and milk. We placed them in narrow, artificially lit cages, stripping them of any ability to engage in their natural behaviors. We managed their reproduction, their diets, and their lifespans with cold, mathematical precision. The triumph of industrial agriculture produced an unprecedented mountain of cheap calories, but it was built on an architecture of silent, mechanized suffering that isolated us completely from the natural world. Yet the most profound and painful transformation of the industrial age did not happen in the factories or the slaughterhouses. It happened inside the human heart and within the four walls of the human home. To truly feel the weight of this change, you must understand how human beings survived for the vast majority of our history. For thousands of years, the individual was almost nothing, but the family and the local community were absolutely everything. If you lived in a traditional village, your community was your entire universe. If you fell ill, there was no state-sponsored hospital. Your family nursed you. If your crops failed, there was no government welfare program. Your neighbors shared their grain so you would not starve. If you were wronged, there was no police force to call. The village elders dispensed justice. You were bound tightly in a web of mutual obligation. This intimate world offered a profound sense of belonging, but it came at a terrible price. The community was an oppressive, suffocating force. You could not choose your profession, you rarely chose your spouse, and if you rebelled against the local traditions, you could be cast out. To be exiled from your family and your village in the pre-industrial world was practically a death sentence. You had no identity and no safety net outside of the local collective. Then the roaring engines of the industrial age arrived, and they needed fuel of a different kind. The massive new factories and the booming urban centers did not need tight-knit tribes or fiercely loyal clans. They needed millions of mobile, independent workers who could pack up and move to wherever the jobs were. They needed individuals. So the new powers of the world, the state and the market, approached the suffocated youth of the traditional villages and offered them a breathtaking, unprecedented deal. The state and the market said, break free. Leave your oppressive fathers and your gossiping neighbors. Move to the city and become whatever you want to be. You do not need your family for survival anymore. If you get sick, we will provide a hospital. If you are robbed, we will send the police. If you grow old, we will give you a pension. If you need food, you do not need to rely on your neighbor's harvest. You can just walk into our grocery stores and buy it with your wages. Humanity accepted the deal. In the span of just a few generations, the ancient, vital structures of the family and the local community, which had held human beings together for millions of years, fractured and collapsed. We traded the oppressive warmth of the village for the liberating coldness of the city. We became free, empowered individuals, completely reliant on the massive, impersonal bureaucracies of the state and the market to provide for our every need. But this newfound liberation created a terrifying emotional void. We are still social animals carrying the evolutionary hardwiring of a tribal species. We need to belong to something larger than ourselves. With the local village gone, the market quickly stepped in to fill the silence, weaving a brand new imagined reality to give our lives meaning. The market gave us consumerism. It told us that our identity was no longer defined by where we were born or who our ancestors were, but by what we chose to buy. Consumerism preaches a very simple, incredibly seductive gospel. If you feel unhappy, if you feel disconnected, if you feel that something is missing from your life, you need to consume a product or an experience. We were encouraged to form new, artificial tribes based on our consumption habits. You are no longer a member of the River Valley tribe. You are a member of the tribe that buys a specific brand of smartphone, eats at specific organic restaurants, and takes specific types of vacations. We try to purchase the feeling of belonging, filling our homes with endless streams of manufactured goods, hoping that the next transaction will finally cure the deep, lingering alienation of modern life. This colossal shift brought about miracles that our ancestors could not have possibly fathomed. Despite the terrifying weapons we invented, the global dominance of the market and the state actually led to the most peaceful era in recorded human history. The violent daily feuds between neighboring tribes were entirely suppressed by the overwhelming authority of state police and international trade networks. We became safer, healthier, and vastly more comfortable than any generation before us. We successfully mechanized the earth, fractured the ancient community, and crowned the individual as the ultimate authority. We broke the biological limits of our world and built a society of staggering, blinding abundance. But as the smoke clears from the industrial century and we stand amidst the towering skyscrapers and overflowing supermarkets we have built, a quiet, haunting question remains. We paid the ultimate price to construct this modern paradise, but did it actually make us happy? Chapter 10. The Horizon of Happiness. We have traveled an unimaginable distance together. We began our journey as terrified, insignificant apes, hiding in the tall grass of the ancient savannah, trembling at the roar of predators in the dark. From that fragile beginning, we harnessed the power of fire. imagined the bonds of empires, invented the cold precision of money, and shattered the biological limits of the earth with the roaring engines of industry. We have mapped the continents, split the atom, and walked in the silent dust of the moon. By every conceivable metric of power and survival, we have conquered the world. We are the undisputed masters of the planet. But as we stand at the summit of human achievement, surrounded by a dizzying abundance of food, medicine, and technology, we must ask ourselves the most important and most terrifying question of all. Are we actually any happier? It seems like an absurd question. We live in a world where a minor infection is cured with a simple pill, rather than being a death sentence. We have heating to banish the winter cold, and refrigeration to preserve our food indefinitely. We do not wake up terrified that a neighboring tribe will raid our village and sell us into slavery. Compared to the grueling, precarious lives of our ancient ancestors, our modern existence looks like an absolute, glittering paradise. We should be dancing in the streets with boundless joy every single day. Yet we are not. We look around our comfortable lives and we still feel a deep, lingering ache of dissatisfaction. To understand why our incredible power has not translated into eternal bliss, we must look at the biological machinery of our own bodies. Imagine someone you know who has spent years dreaming of a singular defining achievement. Perhaps they worked grueling hours to buy a beautiful home, or they sacrificed their personal life to reach the pinnacle of their career. They believe, with every fiber of their being, that once they secure that specific prize, they will finally be happy. And when the day comes when they turn the key in the door of the new house, or sit behind the desk in the corner office, they do experience a massive, euphoric rush of joy. But how long does it last? A month? A year. Inevitably, the thrill fades. The beautiful house becomes just a house. The prestigious job becomes a daily routine filled with new headaches. They return to their baseline level of contentment, and very quickly, they begin looking toward the next goal, convinced that the next acquisition will be the one that finally grants lasting peace. This endless treadmill of desire is not a flaw in our psychology. It is a brilliant, ruthless evolutionary design. If an ancient hunter successfully took down a massive beast and experienced permanent, unwavering happiness, he would simply sit under a tree completely content and eventually starve to death. His genes would not be passed on. Evolution does not care about our happiness. It only cares about our survival and reproduction. Therefore, evolution designed our bodies to reward us with sudden, exhilarating surges of pleasant chemicals, serotonin, dopamine, oxytocin, when we achieve something beneficial. But it also designed those chemicals to dissipate quickly. Happiness is biologically engineered to be fleeting, acting as a temporary bait to keep us running endlessly on the treadmill of survival, always hungry for the next success. Furthermore, our happiness is profoundly dictated by our expectations. When we lived in small, ancient villages, a person might compare themselves to the 50 other people they knew. If you were slightly stronger or had a slightly better harvest than your neighbor, you felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Today, you do not compare yourself to your neighbor. You look at a glowing screen and compare yourself to the wealthiest, most beautiful, and most successful people on the entire planet. As our objective conditions have skyrocketed, our expectations have ballooned right alongside them, ensuring that we constantly feel as though we are falling short. But perhaps happiness is not just a simple chemical equation. Perhaps it is about the stories we tell ourselves. A peasant living in a harsh medieval era might have suffered from hunger and disease, but they truly believed that their suffering was part of a divine cosmic plan and that eternal salvation awaited them. That profound sense of meaning might have made their difficult lives far more joyful than the life of a modern individual who lives in absolute physical comfort but feels completely alienated, viewing the universe as a blind, meaningless void. We have spent millennia manipulating the outside world, diverting rivers, leveling forests, and building cities, believing that if we just organized our external environment perfectly, happiness would follow. It has not. And because manipulating the outside world has failed to grant us lasting peace, we are now turning our terrifying power inward. We are preparing to manipulate the biological world itself. We are currently standing on the very edge of the most profound rupture in the history of life on Earth. For 4 billion years, every single living thing on this planet, from the smallest bacteria to the massive dinosaurs to the ape reading these words, was shaped by the blind, unthinking forces of natural selection. For 4 billion years, biology was constrained by organic chemistry. But today, in silent, brightly lit laboratories around the world, human beings are breaking those fundamental laws. We are taking the pen away from nature. We are replacing natural selection with intelligent design. Imagine a scientist sitting before a glowing monitor manipulating a microscopic string of DNA. They are not waiting for thousands of years of random mutations to cure a disease or enhance a trait. They are actively rewriting the genetic code of a living organism. We are already engineering animals, creating mice with human immune systems and pigs with organs that could be transplanted into human bodies. It is only a matter of time before we begin to aggressively engineer ourselves, altering our own genetic blueprints to enhance our immune systems, extend our lifespans, and perhaps even redesign our emotional capacities. And we are not stopping at organic biology. We are merging our flesh with technology, creating true cyborgs. We have already built bionic limbs controlled entirely by thought and artificial retinas that restore sight. As these technologies accelerate, the boundary between organic life and inorganic machinery will blur and eventually dissolve. Even more staggeringly, we are currently birthing completely non-organic life. Artificial intelligences and computer viruses that can learn, evolve, and replicate completely independent of carbon-based biology. We are not just approaching the end of a historical era, we are approaching the end of Homo sapiens. The creatures that will walk the earth a few centuries from now will likely look back at us the same way we look back at the heavy-browed Neanderthals. They will not just have better tools and faster vehicles. They will have entirely different bodies, different cognitive abilities, and different emotional landscapes. They will be entities of our own design. This brings us to the ultimate haunting realization of our entire journey. We have elevated ourselves from terrified animals to the level of gods. We have the power to create life, to conquer death, and to shape the very fabric of reality. But because we are about to gain the ability to engineer our own desires, to literally rewire what brings us pleasure and what we crave, the most important question facing humanity is no longer, what do we want to become? The true question, the one that will determine the fate of the cosmos, is, what do we want to want? We possess the power of gods, but we still carry the insecure, anxious psychology of the marginal apes we once were. We remain deeply dissatisfied, forever chasing the next fleeting rush of comfort, completely unsure of what will truly bring us peace. We are a species wielding the power of absolute creation, yet we remain entirely blind to our own ultimate purpose. And perhaps, as we gaze out over the vast, shimmering horizon of our future, we must ask ourselves, is there anything more dangerous than dissatisfied, anxious gods who do not know what they want